In previous videos, we've been building from scratch a solution that is very similar to the one automatically built by the work with pattern for us. Thus, if we compare both solutions at runtime, we see first that their design is different. So far, we've focused on the logic and left out the user interface, which we'll get into later on. But leaving aside those visual differences, in both web panels, we can see a grid that shows information of the tourist attractions with filters, and the possibility, for example, of updating the information. In both solutions, the transaction is invoked in update mode. Something that can start to call our attention is a common feature of all the screens we've been browsing. This bar up here, and this one with the links we've recently browsed. We see that every page we open has those parts. For example, if we directly invoke the parallel transaction attraction without parameters, here they are. Or, if we now go to the view of an attraction, the one of the pattern, or the one implemented from scratch by us, we can see that, beyond their differences, they still keep this in common. If now we go to GeneXus to see the form of this view implemented by us, where is this common feature? Or, if we open the attraction transaction, or the parallel transaction that doesn't receive parameters, and we go to its form, we don't see it either. What we see here is a text block control with the name of the transaction. Below is an error viewer control that is where messages appear, for example, for success or failure. Then there's this action group control. It shows the navigation and select buttons. Next, there are attributes. And lastly, another action group with the buttons. Where's the upper sector? If we look at the transaction properties, we see a web transaction group with three very important properties. The first one, theme, will control the design of the controls. The second one we'll see later on. And now we'll see the third one, the master page property. There we indicate the master page, inside which the page corresponding to this transaction object will be loaded. It offers some options, which correspond to all the master pages defined so far in our KB. When a KB is created, these pages are created so that we have some by default, but we'll be able to create others. The transaction was associated with this master page by default when it was created. If we now open the other objects that we were seeing at runtime, we shouldn't be surprised to find that they also have a master page, and it's this one. By the way, note that the web panels also have the same three properties. So let's look for this master page and see what it's all about. If we don't know where it is, we can look for it here and open it. And if we want to find it in the KB Explorer, we can right-click on the tab to do so. It's inside a web folder where GeneXus places objects that have to do with the pattern, for example, and so on. If we look at its properties, we also see one named Theme, and one named Type, and the master page is no longer there. Why? Because it's a special type of web panel, the master page type. A web panel of this type will have a special control, content placeholder. This is where any page that has this one as its master page will be loaded. Then the transaction will be loaded into the space, the view, and everything we saw. Here's the text block control that we see at runtime called application name. For example, let's try to change it to travel agency. Here we have an image that we can also change for this one that we previously inserted in the KB. Let's test the effect of these changes on our application. And here we have them. So, we've already seen two of the three types of web screens, the master page and the common web page, which is what we've been working with so far every time we create a web panel or a transaction. We only have to study the web page of component type. To do this, let's go back over our steps a little and remember what we had implemented in the previous videos. We had the limitation of the attractions work with element, where the user could filter by country by choosing a value in this variable, which was being used in the grid conditions to filter by that country if the variable was not empty. But also, from this panel, the user could see the information of an attraction by clicking on its name, and at the same time, from there, a link was displayed above the country name to show all the relevant information of the country. That's why we called this web panel that received the country identifier in the attribute and showed its name, and then a grid identical to the first one, with the same filters by attraction name, the same columns and actions and general info, and also information about the cities. We can clearly see that part of this panel is almost identical to the other one. Let's suppose that we no longer want the update option to be offered with this image, but we want it to be as it is in the pattern with the word update. We'll have to replace this image with a text block on both panels. To avoid these duplications and to program the behavior and design of a part of the panel only once, we have web panels of the component type. What's repeated in this case? This whole section of the screen and its behavior. Then, we did a save as of this web panel, to which we only removed the country ID variable from the form and placed it instead as a parameter. It'll no longer be entered directly by the user in the form of this screen, but will be received from the caller. We see that the conditions remain identical, as do the events, and everything else. The other change is that we modified the type property, switching it to component. From now on, this web panel can be a component of another one. So, the next thing we did was a save as of our original panel. And we replaced all those controls that we now place in the component web panel with a component type control. Of course, we deleted all the events, here we leave comments, that will now be in the component. By placing a control of this type, we're saying that whatever we specify must be loaded and executed in there. We have to tell it that an instance of the web component we've just shown, country attractions info, has to be created in that component. We can do it in a static way, indicating it in the properties. Here we indicate which will be the component type object, and here the parameter sent. Let's try it. we see exactly the same. If we filter by name of attraction, it's working perfectly. Now what happens if we want to filter by country? Nothing happens. Why? The country ID variable is on a different panel than the attraction grid through which it's filtered. Here, we have to use the control value changed event, which captures the moment the value of the country ID variable control is changed, and have a new instance of the component created, passing it now the new value of the variable. Let's try it. We'll refresh and try to filter by France. Perfect. And there by attraction name. Also perfect. And of course, we did something similar with the panel that showed the country information. We did a save as of this panel, replacing this whole section with a component that will be loaded with this panel. This way, in the new panel, the country ID is not a variable, but it's received in a parameter. So, we can create the component instance in a static way only once inside the execution of this web panel, passing it here the parameter that in this case comes in the attribute received in the parm rule. Note that from the original panel, we removed the controls and programming of events associated with the attractions, and only left those of the cities. Let's try it at runtime. To do this, we invoke this panel and not the previous one. We filter by city, and everything's working correctly. Now, let's change the image to perform the update, and place the text update instead. To do so, in the component web panel, we create a variable of character 20 type. We insert it in the grid. In the start event, we assign it the update value, which is what we want the user to see. We remove the assignment of an image to the variable we had, because we're going to remove it from the grid. And now, let's take the title off the new variable and make it read-only. Let's try to run it. It says that the click is not a valid event. We forgot to change it so that it's the click of the new variable and not the old one. Now we run it. Now we check how it looks in the pattern. Why does it have this much nicer design here? Let's find the control properties in the web panel generated by the pattern. Let's look at these two, class and column class. And let's see the values of these properties for our control, the one we inserted manually in the web panel. They're different. let's assign them the same ones as those of the pattern. And we'll try it. We can see it here. Here we begin to understand how to manipulate the design of the screens. In summary, we've seen three types of web panels that are related to each other. The master page type, which offers a common layout for all the pages of the application or a part of it, so as not to have to repeat the same thing every time for each page. For example, the menus usually go here. This object in particular contains in its form a special control, content placeholder, where the web pages will be loaded. That of web page type, which is the one we've been studying, can have a specific master page associated with it and only one, since it'll be loaded in its content placeholder. And that of component type, which is useful precisely to reuse the same design and programming in different objects. In order to have an object defined as a component type web panel loaded into another web object, the component type control is used, which can be loaded either statically or dynamically. The more components we identify and use, the better the app will be. Of course, there is much more to study in this topic. For example, what happens with the execution of events in a panel with components, how components refreshed, and so on. But this is more than enough for now.